Thank you, Jay, for that tremendous, tremendous introduction. That was so generous and kind of you. And I want to say a couple words about you. Jay had a fantastic impact on the school that he served in Philadelphia. And in fact, the high school principal, and this is one of the toughest inner city high schools in Philadelphia, and Jay and his team had a dramatic impact, said that Jay was the Donovan McNabb of that school. And if you're from Philadelphia, that's like the highest honor that you could possibly have to say about you. And thank you. It's an honor to be here. And I want to thank you, Jay. I also want to say that James Zinner is also an alum of City Year, and it's wonderful that we have two City Year alums at the Clinton School of Public Service. Skip, thank you for inviting me. It's such a pleasure. It's such an inspiration just to walk in the door here. I think the Clinton School of Public Service is an essential new American institution. Absolutely essential because of your values, because of what you're focused on. You're focused on global leadership, civic engagement, and as the first school in the country to award a degree in public service. Someday, all schools of giving master's degree will look back and say, well, you know, we do that too, like they started here at the Clinton School of Public Service. It's absolutely remarkable. And in talking with Jay about the opportunity for students here to do a 10-week internship internationally, that's critically important because, as we all know, the future of this country is about the way in which we're going to interact with the world at large, as well as with how we solve our problems at home. And the intersection between policy, politics, and practical civic engagement is where change happens. And that is just central to this school. So I couldn't be happier to be here. I'm inspired by everything you're doing. As I said to you, Skip, I get all the emails, and I can't believe all the things that are going on in this school in just its first few years. It's providing local, regional, national, and international leadership in public service. And you just have to be so proud to all be members of this community and to be part of it. I'm proud just to be here speaking with you today. I also want to say a special hello to all the red jackets in the room. It's, well, when you got a youth corps, you get a crowd. It's really appreciated that you're here, and I look forward to also going to meet with you guys at the end of the day too and hear all your questions about City Year, and you can grill me then, and I really appreciate you coming out. I can't be in Little Rock and not also mention a few people that have helped to build us here. Stephanie Street is the co-vice chair of our board here and has just done a tremendous job of building City Year. Along with Bruce Moore, the two of them really helped to found City Year here. Once President Clinton said, I really want this associated with my library, and it's just remarkable that there we are above the Library Museum store. And really a part of this community, and it's just really inspiring for us. Former Mayor Jim Daley played a leadership role as well. It's a remarkable group of people that I've been associated with now for almost 10 years in helping to put this together. What I wanted to do is share a little bit with you today about sort of the personal, the political, and the policy road that I've been on now for 20 years, because I think, and especially in a school filled with young people and a school of ideas and a school dedicated to public service, maybe some of these things that I've been through and working on would have some resonance for you. My road to City Year began in earnest when I was assigned to be roommates on September 8th, 1979, my freshman day at Harvard. I was assigned to be roommates with a guy named Alan Casey, literally assigned. I ended up being roommates with Alan Casey for the next 15 years until I got married, and he says I kicked him out. He didn't need the two-bedroom apartment. That was a remarkable happenstance. And for those that often speak to me and say, I'd like to start something, I have a passion for something, what's your advice to me? I always say the same thing: find a partner to work with. The difference between two and one is night and day. And if you have that partner, you have instant team in doing something, and that team can grow bigger and bigger and bigger. And if City Year is anything today, it is essentially a conversation that started with me and Alan in a dorm room in 1979 that's now a larger conversation put into action about service around the country. I spent the very first day at Harvard, not only did I meet Alan Casey, but the president of the university gathered us all together in one place and said, I want to welcome you to Harvard and ask you to please go away. That was his opening line to us. And what he meant by that was to consider spending a year off from college, doing something important, hence the practical internships that you're doing here. I ended up spending as Jay mentioned, a year working for a congressman from California named Leon Panetta. And this was in 1982, and Leon, of course, went on to become President Clinton's budget director and President Clinton's chief of staff. But at the time, he was a congressman representing 200 miles of the prettiest coastline in America. San Luis Obispo, the 17-mile drive, really coastline. And I used to joke to him that he couldn't find anybody that would actually want to leave that beautiful coastline to work in Washington to represent their interests. So we had people like me from Boston doing it, and almost everybody else that was from someplace else. And I got there, and I was 20 years old. And on that very first day, there was a file folder that Leon Panetta had. He said, "This is some legislation I've introduced. I'd like you to work on it." I looked at this file folder. It was H.R. 2500, a bill to set up a commission to study the idea of voluntary national service. I had never heard of this idea of voluntary national service. I opened up the file folder, and it struck me like a thunderbolt. It said that the nation should call on its youth to give a year or two of full-time service, and that so many powerful things would come from it. First, it would be a multi-billion-dollar service resource for the country as young people went into the schools and the playgrounds and the community centers and used their energy and idealism. Two, it could turn young people into experts on what the country needs. Just by engaging in service every day, they would become experts. And over time, they wouldn't be able to be swayed by ideology or even demagoguery, because they'd say, I know what the country needs. I served in that school. I built that playground. I know what this community needs. Third, it would be a civic rite of passage into citizenship, because citizenship is an active sport. It can't be a spectator sport. And being an active citizen full-time, in this case putting this jacket on for a year or two, makes you that full-time citizen. And then the idea would be that after you take the jacket off and go back to civilian life, you'd still be that active citizen, but you'd imbue your whole life with how you go about being that active citizen. Fourth, national service could help engage the whole society by engaging people of all ages and backgrounds in service, not just 17, 18, 19, 20-year-olds, but everybody through big service projects and other forms of civic engagement. Fifth, and this really struck me because I was born in 1960, had older brothers and sisters, and really felt like I was part of the civil rights generation. I guess I was precocious at 8 or 9, but it had a huge impact on me, what was going on in America in the 1960s. And that national service, it was said in this file folder, could help complete the American civil rights movement. That the American civil rights movement had largely, but not completely, but largely ended discrimination under law, but it didn't end discrimination in people's hearts or heads. That only comes from actually working together and doing something together with people who are different from you. And if you actually have to build a playground together or tutor children together, and you're working with someone who you would otherwise have never met and maybe never even talked to, that builds community. That builds trust. And that trust is a form of civic capital that can be used in other ways in the future, just like financial capital can be used to develop our country. And so the idea of completing the civil rights movement through national service leapt off the page for me on Leon's file folder. Next, it said that national service, by tying life-changing benefits to those who serve, could provide access to the American dream for millions of Americans. And it referenced the GI Bill. And for many of you may know, the GI Bill, at its height in World War II, in the Korea era, and still important to us today, provides life-changing benefits, opportunities to go to school or buy a home for those that have served their country in the military. And the idea of national service would be, let's also provide some life-changing benefits for those who serve. A college scholarship tied to service could be life-changing in the sense that it could provide access to the American dream for millions of Americans. Some have described national service as almost like a Swiss Army knife. The reason you carry a Swiss Army knife is because it can do so many things at once. So this idea of spending a year in service captivated me. So there I was, 20 years old, first day on the job, reading Leon's file folder, and I don't know if any of you have ever had this experience, that the first time that you got exposed to an idea, you knew it changed your life forever. I just knew it. I was 20 years old. I said, I was stunned by the power of this idea. And maybe it was because I was 20 years old and no one had asked me to do anything. hadn't really felt like I was being called on, and I'm sure, of course, I could have joined the military or other kinds of things, but I didn't feel that direct ask. So when I saw this, I felt like, wow, I'm one of those fallow resources that's being talked about here. I'm somebody that could be put to work for the country. Well, what about our entire generation? So it spoke to me. I ended up working on that bill for that year. It was Ronald Reagan's first summer as president, and it turned out there wasn't going to be any new major federal legislation happening in 1981, 82 on Congress. They weren't, the Democrats that were in charge of the House weren't even going to bring a bill that only cost $1 million to set up this commission to the floor. They weren't going to do it. But I called up my high school, my college roommate, Alan Casey. I'd left him back at college for this year. I told him about this bill. He said, oh, I studied that in high school. That would most change the country for the better. You should definitely work on that. That was our first conversation about national service with me and Alan. He then came down the following summer of that year that I was with Leon, and we worked on a hearing on this bill. And we decided we would make it the mother of all hearings. And because we found out that when you have a hearing on Capitol Hill, Congress will actually publish everything that's submitted to it. So we wanted to create essentially a handbook of everything that's gone on in the country on national service, even if we couldn't move it forward all the way to getting passed. We invited people that had done the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, that were in their 80s to testify. Incredibly moving. We had people, we had George Gallup do a poll on national service that was very promising and come and testify. We had then Senator Tsongas walk across the street from the Senate side to the House side because one of our other college roommates was interning for him. So he grabbed and said, would you come to my friend's hearing? We used the network of all the young people that were on Capitol Hill that summer as interns to move that forward. So as I said, we didn't get that bill passed. But after that year, I realized, looking back on it now, that I found a passion, a deep passion, a life-changing passion, that I had fought for that passion. That's something, not just finding your passion, but actually fighting for it, working, getting up every day and trying to move it forward. And finally, I had found a partner to work with it. So there I was, now 21 years old, going back to college and realizing, first of all, I love college more. I had 2 years left, and instead of seeing it as an opportunity to sort of have fun, as maybe you do when you're freshman year, when you haven't done a year of national service, and for those of you that aren't yet going to college, but after this, you'll know what I mean. You go to college after a year of service, whether it's domestic or military, you appreciate that opportunity when you're in school or in an environment like this. You just eat it up, and that's what I did. And I dedicated myself to learning everything I could that would set me up to help work on this concept. After college, I found out that Mayor Koch of New York then was starting a national service program in the city of New York to demonstrate it. I went to the director and I said, I have to work on this. I'll work for nothing if I have to. He offered me a job for next to nothing. And I worked for that program for a year. And it was a breakthrough in many ways, but it didn't succeed in uniting young people from different racial and ethnic and economic backgrounds. And it didn't involve the private sector at all. And I realized that was something I cared deeply about. I then went to law school. And in law school, I had a very deep intellectual experience that has really helped with everything I'm doing. I learned about a theory called civic Republican theory. And the term Republican doesn't have anything to do with the modern political party of Republican. It had to do with a theory of democracy. And one theory of democracy is that we're all out for our own interests, and that the role of government is simply to be the honest broker between everybody's interests. That's really the modern view of democracy. But the founders of our Constitution actually were civic Republicans. They didn't really believe so much that everybody should be self-interested, and what they wanted was a nation of people that would be interested in the common good, and they believed that if you could achieve that, you could have common good deliberations, and the role of government would be to inculcate that, what they called civic virtue, coming to the common weal and talking about what the nation needs, not just what you or your group needs. But they were also elitist. We know that. They set up institutions in our framing that didn't allow average Americans to vote for almost anything, much less for president or senate, because they actually thought that you had to be landed white. If you look back at our history, you had to be landed white, and it had to have wealth and education only to participate, to find that common good. I've come to believe that most of American history needs to be about democratizing that original ideal of being about the common good, but doing it in a way that all people from all backgrounds and all Americans participate and lead. And for me, I came to the realization that national service was the missing link in our civic society. Because if everybody spent a year all backgrounds working together, as I mentioned, that would provide the kind of capital, the kind of trust, the kind of capacity for everyone to want to be engaged in public life and to have a really robust common good democracy, where maybe it would become less legitimate to say this is what my group wants, as opposed to this is what the nation needs. So that was law school. The other thing that happened in law school is I fell in love with working on the law. And I decided I would clerk, as Jay mentioned, for a federal judge if I could get a clerkship. And many of you may know those are real prize things to get. You apply a year and a half. So I applied to a few of them, and I was incredibly fortunate to get a clerkship with Judge Stephen Breyer before he was on the Supreme Court. He was a federal First Circuit court. And the idea was I was going to clerk for him. I was going to do, actually, we were going to run a pilot program for Citier over the summer. I was going to clerk for him for a year, and then we were going to run Citier together full-time, year-round, the year after. I had the whole thing planned out. The only problem was you couldn't be a social entrepreneur and start Citier and have it all work and raise millions of dollars and do everything else and basically have a full-time job at the same time. And I realized that after we ran a summer pilot for Citier and I was working for Judge Breyer, and I would then work with Alan all night on proposals for Citier. So here I was all day with Judge Breyer and then all night with Alan on these proposals. Let's start this youth corps. I realized not only wasn't I getting any sleep, but Citier wasn't getting the traction we needed, and I needed to give it my full-time effort. Frankly, I also realized that I was a person that really had one foot on two different boards. That was the metaphor I had. One was this incredible opportunity I had gone to Harvard College and Harvard Law School and having opportunities to go to top firms that were putting huge salaries out there. The only problem, that wasn't where my passion was. My passion was in the service work. And so I had one foot literally in that and one foot in the other, and it literally was day and night in terms of how I was doing that. And push came to shove, I realized that I had to choose, that the boards were moving further and further and further apart. And I tell this story because many of you in the room will face a situation like this, where you have to decide, are you going to go with sort of a traditional path, or if you have a passion for something, might you go and do something less traditional? And my point in telling you this is not to say, oh, do what I did, that's the right thing. My point is to tell you my story and say what I did, but also, follow your passion. And oftentimes that passion does lead to what could be considered a more traditional role in the private sector and other areas where you can do so much good. But if you do have a passion and it takes you a little bit off the beaten track, because for me, I realized that after all these other sort of brass ring experiences, going off to start Citier was a little bit like running off to join the circus. It's like, what do you tell your grandmother and everybody else after you go do all these other things? You're going to go start this thing. And I realized I had to walk into Judge Stephen Breyer's office 4 months into the clerkship and tell him that I had to leave. Toughest decision I ever made, toughest thing I ever had to do. This was a big deal to walk into his office and say that. And I sat down with him and I told him why, and I told him what this had come to. I also had a friend that was clerking somewhere else that was finishing up. I said, he's great, he was on a law review, he's fabulous, he's better than me. It still didn't make it easier to say this. And Judge Breyer was great. He was a little stunned that no one had ever really done this before. And then the next 4 months, I kind of reversed it. I worked all day with Alan and worked at night with Judge Breyer finishing up his opinions. It was the most important thing I ever did to realize where my passion was, what I wanted to do and work on. And Judge Breyer, Justice Breyer, has since become a dear friend and has spoken at Citier many times and likes to tell the story himself of how he helped to start Citier by encouraging me, which he did. And so you can even have all of that happen in those experiences. When we were starting Citier, we were inspired by a number of things. One was the LA Olympics. In 1984, the Olympics were being led by a guy named Peter Ueberroth, and he took the Olympic movement, which was largely dying, because in Montreal, the city of Montreal had tried to run the Olympics entirely by themselves, and it nearly bankrupted the city of Montreal earlier in the 70s. In 1984, Peter Ueberroth, who then wanted to become commissioner of baseball, he's the one that said there could be private sector support of the Olympics. And we may all bemoan today that there's too much commercialism of the Olympics, but without Peter Ueberroth, there would have been no Olympics, perhaps. And the engagement of the private sector was huge. We were also really inspired by people like Stephen Jobs and Steve Wozniak that were creating Apple Computer in their garage. So our idea in starting Cityyear was we want to be social policy entrepreneurs. We want to see if we can get people excited about the national service concept and essentially create a youth corps in our garage, and we wanted to do it with the private sector. And if there could be an official toothpaste of the Olympic basketball team, as there was in 1984, why not an official corporate sponsor or two of a youth corps? So we took our case to the private sector. We went to places like the Equitable, Bank of Boston, Bain and Company, Timberland, which you saw on the tape, and eventually they began to say yes. And for our first 4 years, Cityyear was entirely privately sponsored. And when we had 100 corps members, when President Clinton came to visit us, there wasn't any public dollars in it at that time. And it was really remarkable. And what we learned is that there's tremendous idealism in the private sector. There are people in the private sector that had grown up in the 60s and the 70s and the 50s, and they had wanted to use their skills, and they wanted their companies to express values, as the Timberland company talked about, as Jeff Schwartz on the tape talked about, and that they also realized that their employees wanted to express their values, and that a company could be more competitive with getting talent if they could do that through investing in organizations like Cityyear, and that their customers didn't leave their values essentially at the cash register when they were purchasing things. And now, of course, we know what a strong movement that is, that to this, nowadays, it's every single consumer in the generation, the young generation in this room is really leading that in terms of really, you see your dollars as votes, and that's incredibly important, and that has a huge impact on how we're changing our economy for the better. So we reached out to the private sector, and we were able to start entirely privately. We were able to put together a diverse core of young people in the city of Boston, from the suburbs, from the inner city, from people that had graduated college, from those that had dropped out of high school. It was a whole mix of people. And that was the number one thing we wanted to demonstrate, that national service could unite young people of all those backgrounds. We realized that what we were trying to do, we ended up putting a name to it. We called it an action tank. We coined the term action tank as sort of like a combination of a think tank, where you work on ideas alone, and a program where you just simply act and run something. The concept of an action tank is designed in our minds to try to move a policy idea forward by demonstrating it, shining a bright light on it, constantly looking for what's in the way of it moving forward and working on that as a next issue, and getting people to visit it. So when we started Cityyear, we said it was a demonstration of national service. We invited the media. I look back at some of the early press releases we had done now in 1988. I'm a little embarrassed by them. There was some combination of innocence and arrogance that said this little 50-person youth corps was a demonstration of national service, come see national service in action kind of thing. But that's what we were trying to suggest, that this could be, if it was writ large, could change the country. And we were able to bring a whole bunch of visitors through the program. And in 1992, during the election campaign, we invited every single presidential candidate, put out a letter to every single campaign. And guess who came? Governor Bill Clinton came to see us. And as many of you may know, he was head of the Democratic Leadership Council at the time. He was head of the Governors Association. He cared about the concept of national service. From a policy perspective, we found out that he had been asked about it in the campaign, and then one of his aides said, you should go visit that Cityyear program that aide had visited. And he said, let's go do that. So he came to visit us in December of 1991. It was 2 months before the February primary in New Hampshire. It was a real critical time for his campaign. He ended up spending about 4 or 5 hours with us. He sat at a table much like this, a round table with 5 corps members, with the mayor of Boston, and our lead corporate sponsor from Bain & Company at the time named Mitt Romney. And that was the group that sat with Bill Clinton, governor of Arkansas. And at the time, Governor of Arkansas asked all these questions of the young people and said that he was really moved by it, that he believed in it, and if he got elected president, he was going to do something on this. And then one of the young people at the table took off his Cityyear sweatshirt and gave it to him and said, please don't forget us, Governor Clinton. And he said, I won't forget you. Stephen was his name, or any of you. That was in December. He went on with the campaign, became president-elect. 11 months later, he was president-elect, and he was jogging the day after Thanksgiving. It was the Friday after Thanksgiving. I was at home taking a day off. Alan was at his home. Remember, I kicked him out? He's at his home. CNN is this new network that we're just like enthralled by, and we're watching CNN. I'm watching CNN, and the president-elect is jogging, and when he stops, all the cameras go to him, and we look at him, and I said, oh my goodness, he's wearing his City Year sweatshirt that Stephen Spalos gave him 11 months before when he visited City Year. Well, I'm reaching for the phone. As I'm reaching, it rings. One motion. I don't say anything except, are you watching this? Yes, it's amazing. Call you back. Bye, bye. That was Alan. And we realized right then that having President Clinton behind this, with the power of the presidency and his tremendous skills and his passion for young people and his belief in this, was the thing that all of us in the national service field were always hoping would happen one day. Because national service is a concept, frankly, that if you ask most Americans of any background, and Republican, Democrat, rich, poor, anything, and you explain it to them, they all love it. They all like, that's great, having Americans do that. But it's not a voting issue. It's not health care, the national debt, things like that. And when President Clinton elect had a camera in front of him and a microphone, when he was stopped after jogging in our sweatshirt, he was asked what his priorities for the country would be. And he said they would be, the national economy was 1, the national debt was 2, healthcare was 3, and national service was 4. National service? Well, for policy wonks like me, that this is the passion, you thought we had just died and gone to national service heaven. And from that moment on, the trajectory of our organization and the movement, and we were just one small part of this movement. I appreciated what Jay said, but we were one small part of this movement. There are many organizations that were working on this and many people involved. Senator Kennedy had a huge impact, Harris Wofford and others, and of course, President Clinton. And so, but when he said that, everything changed. He sent members of his transition team to City Year. We ended up having the privilege of working on the AmeriCorps legislation with Harris Wofford, with Eli Siegel, with Senator Kennedy, as well as Republican leaders. It was a bipartisan effort, and it was a privilege to work on that. And because of AmeriCorps, City Year is today in 18 cities. So when President Clinton came to visit us, we were in 1 city. And today, we're in 18 cities, because what AmeriCorps did, and the genius of AmeriCorps, is that it's a grants program on a competitive basis with strong evaluation, with a lot of people looking at those grants. And we were able to compete successfully around the country, which puts an initial grant in a community, and then we're able to match private dollars. For every AmeriCorps dollar that's been invested in City Year, nearly 4 private dollars have been invested. And that's an example of really creative government that brings new value, and it's a real new way of doing things. Today, there's over 500,000 Americans, including all of you in red jackets in the room, that have been sworn into AmeriCorps. That's extraordinary. It's nearly 10 times the size of the Peace Corps, simply by the size of the number of people that have been able to do it. And we crossed that threshold this past May. I had the privilege of meeting with President Clinton right after he left office, and we talked about continuing to work with him. One of the things we talked about would be starting a youth corps that would be associated very closely with his library to bring national service, AmeriCorps, right into the heartbeat of the library as an active citizen engagement and civic engagement center. And you see that's happened with the people that I mentioned, with Stephanie and Bruce, and obviously President Clinton and Jim Daly and others. And that's been such a blessing to be here and to be part of this community. The other thing we talked to President Clinton about was that we wanted to engage overseas in this concept, because we didn't think that national service was an American concept. In fact, other countries like Nigeria and Israel were way ahead of America in terms of their programs. And we wanted to start a fellowship in his name. And he agreed to let us start the Clinton Democracy Fellowship, which would engage people from around the world in spending a summer or so in City Year to learn not just about City Year, but about many service organizations. We could learn from them, and then maybe they could learn from our country and our organizations, and we could help spark national service initiatives in other countries. We said we wanted to start in South Africa. We met with him in February, a month after he left office. We thought we would have a good year to design that fellowship and get back to him with some ideas, because he said, go ahead and try to work on that. We then got a call from Eli Siegel 30 days later. And Eli said, I just got off the phone with President Clinton. Nelson Mandela just called him. He wants, Nelson Mandela asked President Clinton to speak in South Africa in 30 days. And he wants to bring City Year with him to launch that fellowship and to start recruiting people to come over from South Africa. So this was great. We had never even learned what a J9 visa was. We hadn't raised any dollars for this, but that's the catalyst that President Clinton is. And we were able, in about those 30 days, to put the resources together to learn how to start a fellowship and to bring people over. And what's that led to is that today there is a City Year program in South Africa, City Year South Africa. It's in Johannesburg. President Clinton has visited it 3 times, most recently this summer. It is the largest City Year program in the City Year network, with over 200 members, and the fastest growing one. And I think it's just, it warms my heart. When I was in college, at the height of apartheid, most of our political activities as college students was about ending apartheid in South Africa. And if you had asked me then that I would help be part of anything that organized blacks and whites to work in South Africa, in a free South Africa when Nelson Mandela was president, I'd say, you're kidding. This is an impossibility. And it's those kinds of perspectives that we all have to have in the world. If something like that is possible, anything is possible, that Nelson Mandela went from prisoner to president, and that President Clinton was able to do all these things with AmeriCorps and so many others, just shows us what's possible as citizens and as leaders. Just a couple of things that I just want to leave you with. Today, we're focused on building City Year and saying yes to new communities, but we are still focused, of course, on policy ideas. Our goal is the most commonly asked question of a young person is, where will you do your service year? That becomes the question that everybody commonplace asks a young person. We are engaging in the presidential campaign again from a policy perspective in a nonpartisan way. We have proposed a new GI Bill for the 21st century. And what the idea is, the new GI Bill would say, serve in the Marines or the Navy or any part of the armed forces, or in Teach for America, or Youth Build, or City Year, or Citizen Schools, or Jumpstart. Serve in one of them and get benefits from it. Come to a one-stop place, one recruitment center, all the recruitment centers, military and domestic service combined. Bring ROTC to every single campus in America, but include a civic leadership component as well. Have it possible for people when they sign up for the military, and they sign up often for 7 years at a time, 5 to 7 years, that 2 or 3 of those years could actually be done in a domestic service capacity as well. So combine the military and domestic worlds in this. We are proposing something called the National Service Baby Bond. And this is the idea of this is that it would be a bookend to Social Security. The baby bond idea is that a mutual fund account would be created in the name of every child born in America. And the federal government would put a certain starter dollars into that bond. It's essentially a mutual fund for that child, $1,000 to $5,000, say. And others could add to it over time, and through good investments over time, that would be worth more. And by time someone turns 18 years old, or they could access it to go to college if they have done a year of service in the military or in a domestic service experience. And if they don't use it over, say, a 10-year period, it reverts back to other bonds to be set up. So over time, it could be self-sustaining. This National Service Baby Bond, we think, is a structural way to provide access to the American dream. And by providing resources tied to the reciprocity of service early in one's life, just like Social Security is tied to the reciprocity of actually working your entire life, those would be the bookends of what it means to have a social compact in America tied to service and hard work. We've worked closely with Time Magazine on a cover story that came out on Labor Day. The Case for National Service. Richard Stengel is the managing editor of Time Magazine. And he approached us saying that he wanted to write a cover story and work with the national service field on it because he is passionate about this idea. And this story calls for the baby bond, it calls for the new GI Bill, and it calls for the next president of the United States to work to engage 1 million Americans by the end of his or her second term in 2016, 1 million Americans a year in service. To put that into perspective, there are 75,000 a year in AmeriCorps, and there's about 8,000 in the Peace Corps. So we're talking extremely significant growth is being called for. And one of the things that we're particularly excited about is the way in which national service participants could be utilized with regards to the problems facing society. We are proposing that 100,000 young Americans be called on a new increase in AmeriCorps of 100,000 just to work in America's schools, just to work on what's been called the high school dropout crisis in America. Last week, Johns Hopkins University released a very powerful and very concerning study that said in most urban communities in America, the high school dropout rates is at alarming proportions. Between 30 and 60% of people entering high school in those urban communities are not graduating within even a 5-year period. And what needs to be done, they've said, is we need to concentrate on the schools where the dropout rate is the highest. In fact, 15% of the schools in America are producing 50% of all the dropouts. What if national service participants, many of you in your room know the impact you can have in schools, and you saw Skip from New Hampshire on the tape. What if national service participants went into those 15% of those schools and worked with all the kids who are failing? Because, frankly, I've learned if you're failing, it's largely because you're embarrassed because you're not reading at grade level. So you act out and eventually you leave because you feel the place is not for you. Those children and those young adults need extra attention that I think a national service participant could lead. So in closing, and I want to take a few questions if there's time, my message is, first of all, thank you again for inviting me to this very special, essential New American institution. Thank you for letting me talk to you about what I've been passionate about since I opened Leon's file folder when I was 20 years old. Thank you for all you in the Red Jackets for serving in City Year. And for all of you that are still working on your education and deciding sort of what are you going to do with your life, let me just say to you that you're needed. Your country needs you, your community needs you, your world needs you. And you don't really have to sacrifice. There's some things, maybe pay and income at various times in your life, but the psychic income, the benefits of community, the people you get to meet, the things you get to work on, the sense of being empowered and passionate every single day is something that I wouldn't have traded for anything. So you're absolutely needed. All your skills that you're learning in your grad school experience and your college experience are completely transferable to changing the world. So thank you. Thank you for inviting me.